Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. We got some really interesting stuff sent in this time around.
Yeah, this is gonna be a fun one.
It is. Someone sent us some excerpts from Philip Ball's book, How Life Works, A User's Guide to the New Biology.
Oh yeah, I know that one.
So we're going to dive into that today.
Very cool.
And basically, we're going to try to understand like how life actually works.
Yeah, get down to the nitty-gritty.
Right. Like beyond those simplified explanations that we all got in high school.
Exactly, because it's so much more complicated than that.
Way more. And one of the things that really struck me when I was looking through this book was how Ball talks about like randomness and noise
Mm-hmm.
in biological systems
Huh.
and how life like actually uses it to its advantage.
Oh yeah, it's not just fighting against it.
Right. That's what I always thought. But it's more like it embraces it, you know?
Absolutely. It's like, think about a city, right? You've got people rushing around, traffic construction, all this stuff happening.
Yeah, it seems chaotic.
Right. But there's an underlying order to it all. Like everyone's going somewhere, doing something.
That's a great analogy. So it's like that with cells too.
Exactly. They're operating in this noisy molecular world, but they've evolved to actually use that noise.
So it's not just about genes dictating everything.
Right. It's this constant interplay between genes and their environment.
And speaking of genes, Ball really dives into how the concept of a gene itself is more complex than we usually think.
Oh, for sure. Like that whole one gene, one trait thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's way too simplistic.
Like I remember learning that in school, but it's obviously not the whole story.
Not even close. It's more like each gene can have multiple functions depending on the context.
So it's like a single ingredient that can be used in tons of different recipes.
Exactly. Like flour. Right. You can make bread, cake, cookies, all sorts of things with just flour.
So one gene can be involved in tons of different processes.
Right. Depending on what's going on in the cell.
That's so cool. And then there's the idea of jumping genes, which totally blew my mind.
Oh, yeah, the transposons.
Yeah. It's like our DNA isn't static at all.
No, it's constantly changing and rearranging itself.
Like it can actually rearrange itself.
It can. These transposons can move around within the genome.
Wow. So who figured that out?
A scientist named Barbara McClintock, she actually won a Nobel Prize for it.
Wow. A Nobel Prize. That's amazing.
Yeah, she faced a lot of resistance at first. People didn't believe her.
But she was right.
She was. And now we know that these jumping genes can actually influence the activity of other genes.
So how does all this, like the jumping genes and the randomness, fit into how genes are regulated?
Well, it turns out gene regulation is super complex.
More complex than just an on-off switch.
Way more. Think of it like an orchestra with tons of instruments all playing together.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Each instrument is contributing to the overall sound, and there are all these different factors controlling how loud or soft each one is, when they start and stop playing, and so on.
So what are some of those factors?
Well, there are things like transcription factors.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about those.
They're like the conductors of the orchestra. They tell the genes when to turn on and off.
And Ball uses the example of the lac operon in bacteria, right?
Yeah, that's a classic example. It's basically a little genetic circuit that controls how bacteria digest lactose.
Lactose, that's low sugar, right?
Yep. So if there's lactose around, the transcription factors make sure the genes for digesting it are turned on.
And if not, they stay off.
Exactly. It's a really efficient system.
So that's transcription factors. What else is involved?
There are also these things called non-coding RNAs.
Non-coding. So they don't actually code for proteins.
Right. For a long time, scientists thought they were junk DNA, but now we know they're super important.
What do they do?
They regulate gene expression in all sorts of ways, like they can interact with DNA, other RNAs, even proteins.
So they're like adding another layer of complexity to this whole orchestra thing.
Exactly. And there are tons of different types of non-coding RNAs, but one type that's especially interesting is called long ncRNAs.
Long ncRNAs. Okay, what makes them so interesting?
Well, they can be really long, like hundreds or even thousands of nucleotides long, and they're involved in some really complex processes,
Like what?
like X chromosome inactivation. You know how females have two X chromosomes?
Yeah.
Well, one of them gets shut off, and long ncRNAs are involved in that.
Wow, so they're involved in like deciding which genes get expressed.
Yeah, and they're also involved in cell differentiation, which is how cells become specialized to do different things.
It's like how a stem cell can become a muscle cell or a brain cell.
Exactly. So they're playing a really important role in development.
That's amazing. And then there's epigenetics, which I always find a bit mysterious.
Oh, yeah. It's like, how can something affect our genes without changing the actual DNA sequence?
Right, it's like magic or something.
It kind of is, But it's basically about chemical modifications to the DNA and the proteins that package it.
So it's like adding notes to a musical score without changing the actual notes themselves.
Exactly. And these modifications can affect which genes are turned on or off.
So it's like adding bookmarks or highlighting certain passages in a book.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating is that things like our diet, exercise, and even stress levels can affect our epigenetics.
So our lifestyle choices can actually change how our genes are expressed.
They can. It's pretty mind-blowing, right?
Yeah, it makes you realize that we have a lot more control over our health than we might think.
We do. And it also means that our experiences can be passed down to future generations.
Whoa, let's get into some deep stuff.
It is. But it's also really exciting because it means that we can potentially break cycles of disease and create a healthier future.
That's a great point. It's like we're not just stuck with the genes we inherit. We can actually influence how they're expressed.
Right. And that's a really powerful message.
It is. So this is all about how genes are regulated, but I'm also curious about how cells actually make decisions.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other level of complexity.
Because it can't just be about genes dictating everything, right?
Right. Cells are constantly responding to their environment and making decisions based on the information they receive.
And Ball talks about this idea of structure for free, which sounds really intriguing.
Oh, yeah. That's all about liquid phase separation.
Liquid phase separation, what is that?
It's basically how cells can create compartments within themselves without needing to build any physical structures.
Wait, so they don't actually build walls or anything?
Nope. It's like shaking a bottle of oil and water. You know how those little droplets of oil form?
Yeah, I've seen that.
Well, cells can do something similar. They can form these little droplets of different molecules within themselves.
So it's like they're creating these temporary compartments whenever they need them.
Exactly. It's super efficient.
That's amazing. But if they're creating all these compartments, how do they actually communicate with each other?
Well, they use a variety of signals like chemical signals, mechanical signals, even electrical signals.
Wow, it's like they have their own little language.
They do. And they're constantly talking to each other, coordinating their activities.
So it's like a city, but on a microscopic scale.
Exactly. There's all this bustling activity going on, but it's all very organized and purposeful.
It makes you wonder how all of this complexity came about in the first place.
It does, and that's what we're going to explore next, how this incredible system of communication and coordination actually shapes the development of an organism.
Oh, I can't wait to dive into that. It sounds fascinating.
It is. And it's going to challenge our traditional views of development as this pre-programmed process.
Because it's not just about following a blueprint.
Right. It's much more dynamic and flexible than that.
I'm really looking forward to learning more.
Me too. This is going to be good. So we've been talking about genes and how they're regulated.
Yeah, it's way more complex than I ever imagined.
Right. Like this whole idea of jumping genes and epigenetics, it really changes how we think about DNA.
It does. It's not just this static blueprint. It's like this dynamic, ever-changing code.
Exactly. And that leads us to this really interesting question about purpose.
Purpose. You mean like the purpose of life?
Yeah. Like, do living things actually have a purpose? Or is it all just random chance and survival of the fittest?
That's a big question. I mean, I've always thought of evolution as this blind process, just random mutations and natural selection.
Right, that's the classic view. But Ball suggests that maybe there's more to it than that.
Really? So he thinks that living things actually have a purpose.
Well, he talks about this idea of agency, like even simple organisms have this capacity to act with purpose.
Act with purpose. What does that even mean for like a bacterium?
Well, think about it. A bacterium can sense its environment, right?
Yeah, like it can detect chemicals and stuff.
Right. And it can move towards food or away from danger.
So it's making decisions.
It is. It's not just passively floating around. It's actively interacting with its environment.
But is that really purpose? Or is it just instinct?
That's a good question, and it's one that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
Yeah, I'm sure they have.
But Ball argues that even if we don't fully understand what purpose is, we can see evidence of it in the way living things behave.
So like the bacteria moving towards food, that's an example of purpose.
It could be. It's certainly goal-directed behavior, and it seems to benefit the bacterium's survival.
Okay, I can see that. But what about more complex organisms like animals?
Well, Ball talks about how animals exhibit even more sophisticated forms of agency.
Like how?
Well, they can learn from their experiences, they can solve problems, they can even cooperate with each other.
So they're not just reacting to their environment, they're actively shaping it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because it suggests that maybe evolution isn't just about random chance.
You mean it's actually being driven by the choices that organisms make?
It could be. I mean, think about it. If organisms are actively shaping their environments, then that's going to influence the selective pressures that drive evolution.
So it's like a feedback loop. The environment shapes the organism, but the organism also shapes the environment.
Right, and that means that evolution might not be as blind or as random as we once thought.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. I mean, we can see how humans have shaped our own evolution through things like agriculture and technology.
Exactly. And Ball argues that this capacity for niche construction, as he calls it, might be a fundamental property of life itself.
So it's not just something that humans do, it's something that all living things do to some extent.
Right. And that raises some really fascinating questions about the role of agency in evolution.
Like what?
Well, if organisms are actively shaping their evolutionary destinies, then that means that maybe free will isn't just an illusion.
Whoa, now we're getting into some deep philosophical territory.
We are, but it's a question that Ball doesn't shy away from, and he suggests that the more we learn about biology, the more we realize that we don't have all the answers.
It's kind of humbling, right? Like we think we're so smart, but there's still so much we don't know about life.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes biology so fascinating. It's this constant journey of discovery.
And this idea of agency, it really adds a whole new dimension to that journey.
It does. It makes you wonder if maybe there's more to life than meets the eye.
Like there's some kind of underlying purpose or direction.
Maybe. And even if there isn't, I think it's inspiring to think that we might have more control over our destinies than we realize.
I agree. It gives me hope for the future. Like maybe we can actually shape our own evolution in a positive direction.
I think we can. And I think this new understanding of biology is going to play a big role in that.
I'm excited to see where it all leads.
Me too.
Yeah.
This is just the beginning of an incredible journey of discovery.
Okay, so we've been talking about this new view of biology.
How it's not just a simple machine, right?
Right. It's way more dynamic and complex than that.
And even purposeful in a way.
Exactly. But I'm curious about how this actually changes things for us.
Like, what are the practical implications?
Yeah. Like, how does this affect things like medicine and agriculture and our relationship with the environment?
Well, one area where it's having a huge impact is definitely medicine.
Makes sense. We've been talking about how genes aren't the whole story.
Right. And Ball argues that this gene-centric view of disease, while it's been helpful, it's also kind of limiting.
Yeah, because it's not just about fixing one gene.
Exactly. Diseases often involve whole tissues and organs, not just individual genes.
So, like, what does that mean for gene therapies?
Well, they definitely have potential, but Ball cautions against seeing them as a cure-all.
Because sometimes just fixing one gene isn't enough.
Right. There are so many other factors involved, like epigenetics and the environment.
So instead of just focusing on genes, we need to think about the whole system.
Exactly. And that's where this new understanding of biology can really help.
So how does that change how we approach treating diseases?
Well, for one thing, it means we might be able to use existing drugs to treat a wider range of diseases.
Oh, interesting. Like how?
Well, if we understand the underlying cellular mechanisms that are common to many different diseases.
Then we could potentially repurpose drugs that already target those mechanisms.
Exactly, instead of having to develop a brand new drug for each specific disease.
That would be amazing. It would save so much time and money.
Right. And it could also lead to more effective treatments because we'd be addressing the root cause of the problem.
So it's like a more holistic approach to medicine.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole system and how everything interacts.
And that's not just about treating diseases, it's also about preventing them.
Absolutely. Like we were talking about earlier, our lifestyle choices can actually change how our genes are expressed.
So by making healthy choices, we can potentially reduce our risk of developing certain diseases.
Right. And that's really empowering because it means we have more control over our health than we might think.
That's a great point. But what about those diseases that are really strongly influenced by our genes, like certain types of cancer?
Well, even there, this new understanding of biology can offer some insights.
Like how?
Well, Ball challenges the traditional view of cancer as a disease of cells.
Okay, so what is it then?
He argues that it's actually a disease of organization.
A disease of organization.
Yeah. It's basically a breakdown in the normal communication and coordination between cells in a tissue.
So it's like the cells are going rogue. They're not following the rules anymore.
Exactly. They start behaving selfishly, growing, and dividing uncontrollably.
And that's what causes the tumor.
Right. And this perspective could lead to new approaches to treatment.
Like how?
Well, instead of just trying to kill the cancer cells, we might be able to develop therapies that restore normal cell communication.
So like getting the cells to play nice again.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating idea, and it's just one example of how this new understanding of biology is changing how we think about disease.
It's amazing. It feels like we're on the verge of a whole new era of medicine.
I think we are. And it's not just medicine. This new understanding of biology is also having an impact on agriculture.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like
It
understanding how plants interact with their environment,
Exactly. And how they interact with microbes in the soil.
which is super important for things like nutrient cycling and disease resistance,
Right. And it could help us develop more sustainable and resilient farming practices.
especially with the challenges of climate change and a growing population.
Exactly. We need to find ways to produce more food with fewer resources, and this new understanding of biology can help us do that.
And it's not just about agriculture. It's also about our relationship with the environment as a whole.
Absolutely. By recognizing the interconnectedness of all living things, we can start to appreciate the importance of biodiversity and the delicate balance of
It's
ecosystems.
like we're all part of this incredible web of life, and we need to take care of it.
Exactly. And this new understanding of biology can help us do that.
It's been an incredible journey exploring all of these ideas, and I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the complexity and beauty of life.
I'm glad to hear that, and I hope it inspires you to keep learning and exploring.
It definitely does. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of biology. We encourage you to check out the sources we've discussed and keep asking questions about the world around you. There's always more to discover.